Yugoslavia's crisis is spreading fast.
More airstrikes have been reported south of Ljubljana, and casualties are mounting.
Most of their victims here have been not soldiers but civilians. After this, the Slovenians are hardly likely to want to talk about peace and unity.
Now the bridges are broken.
In shootouts across the state, Slovenia's lightly armed defense forces were fighting to protect their newly declared independence. The army was clearly surprised by the level of resistance. The Slovenian firepower proved accurate and awesome. But you have had to fight many times.
Yeah.
You don't want to fight?
Nobody wants to fight. Ask, everybody ask him. Nobody wants to fight.
My brother-in-law lives around here, and I don't want to even think about seeing him with a gun pointing at me. I mean, it's a nightmare.
They say they have sympathy for their conscripted countrymen, but they'll do what's necessary.
They can never win, you see. Long term, short term, never win.
There is no force in the world that can stop the determination of people to achieve their independence.
Look at the tanks! They must go down! They must go down!
Will you settle for anything less than full independence now?
It is difficult, really, to envisage a union of Yugoslav republics after the experience that we have had.
Simultaneous declarations of independence are expected on Wednesday by Slovenia and Croatia, the two most prosperous and westernized republics. Macedonia has said that it intends to follow suit, and a referendum is expected there shortly. And most observers expect the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, a very ethnically mixed place even by Yugoslav standards, to initiate a move towards independence. In a country where, in the words of the federal prime minister today in Zagreb, secession is a bomb which could destroy us all, only the army remains as a truly federal force. While it may not be used to put down secession, the army's presence prevents the expected declarations of independence from being truly substantive.
Slovenia and Croatia, and possibly Macedonia, will declare independence. There can be no doubt about that. But the declarations of independence will lack substance. The federal armed force will continue to be stationed on the soil of Croatia and Slovenia. It will continue to guard their international frontiers. Therefore, the secessionist republics will not be able to claim that they are in control of their own territory. That being the case, they will not be able to gain diplomatic recognition.
Političkim pluralizmom, demokracijama.
The federal Prime Minister, Ante Markovic, has been warning of the dangers of secession for some time. Today in Zagreb, the capital of Croatia, Markovic said, "The next few days are crucial for the existence of Yugoslavia, which has become a danger to the stability of Europe."
Those who are always threatening or warning against civil war in Yugoslavia are those who would like it to happen. I don't think that Mr. Markovic would like to see a civil war, but basically we don't really believe that there would be a civil war in Yugoslavia, and it had all those victims in Yugoslavia were not between all these killings between, let's say, village against village on ethnical basis, but was done by state repression, by the people in uniforms.
Some of the neighboring countries are not necessarily disinterested in the breakup of Yugoslavia. We can think of Bulgaria and its pretensions on Macedonia. We can think of Albania because of the large numbers of ethnic Albanians living within Yugoslavia. We can think of Hungary, which would be very worried about the position of its own large 500,000 strong minority in northern Serbia, and so on and so forth. The potential for destabilization is very real indeed.
Tonight, the breakaway Republic of Slovenia marked out its international frontier with military intent at a hastily erected border post Armed police patrolled under a cocktail umbrella. The federal government say it's illegal, but the Slovenes are ready to fight to protect their new sovereignty.
We must.
You will fight?
Yes.
Yugoslavia's bitter ethnic divisions have never been more apparent than they are at this new border post tonight. It seems that this nation, so long plagued with violence, is once more descending into crisis. And many feel that conflict is now unavoidable. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, on the Croatian-Slovenian border. Yugoslavia's army smashed its way into Slovenia. Tanks ordered in by the country's central government to tame the breakaway republic. Barricades erected by the Slovenes to protect their capital, Ljubljana, were brushed aside. As this amateur video shows, there was resistance. Angry Slovenes stoned one tank as it barged through. The army's commanding general warned that his troops would use all powers to crush the resistance. It appeared a crude show of force as the Yugoslavian tanks rode roughshod into this newly declared republic. Left in their wake a trail of mangled vehicles. The central government claimed its army was only maintaining national unity, but Slovenia's president condemned it as an act of aggression. To the Slovenian people, this was no less than an army of occupation. Many believe the troops would not have marched in if there had been international support for their independence.
Without the support of Europe and without the support of America, this wouldn't happen, of course. They wouldn't have the strength, they wouldn't have the courage to do this. And this is really, this is terrible.
But as more armored columns bore down on the capital, Slovenian defiance was growing. In one town, local police commandeered a train to block the army's progress. As townsfolk cheered, the troops were thwarted. At Ormož, Slovenia's own defense force blew up an oil tanker to stop Yugoslavian troops heading off to secure the national borders. But some tanks had already reached the frontier with Austria. As if to show to the outside world that Yugoslavia's central government was still in control of its borders, the tanks fired live charges to clear another roadblock. But one column of Yugoslav reinforcements never made it through to Ljubljana. The first Slovenian roadblock they encountered held them up for 6 hours before local police agreed to let them pass. While one barricade opened, more serious obstacles lay ahead. Unwittingly, the Yugoslav convoy was driving into a trap. On the road ahead, the Slovenian Defence Force was preparing for its first major confrontation. The local troops, armed with anti-tank missiles, emerged from the wooded hills to block off the convoy's advance and retreat. Boxed in, the armoured vehicles formed into battle formation, their turrets scouring the hillside for sign of attack. But tonight, the standoff continued. The opposing forces have faced each other for 7 hours now in what appears to be a test of nerve, but as yet they haven't fired a shot. So far, there's been no serious bloodshed. The Slovene army apparently content to prove that these Yugoslav troops are the aggressors, but the Slovenes warn that if it comes to it, they will fight for their independence. And that conflict may not be long in coming, as tonight more Yugoslav tanks ploughed through eastern Croatia. As the two republics defend their right to independence, the dimensions of Yugoslavia's crisis is spreading fast. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Slovenia. Jeremy Thompson, ABC News, Slovenia. Jeremy Thompson, CTV, Slovenia.
At Manchester Airport, holidaymakers turned up today ready to go to Yugoslavia, but they were told their flights had been cancelled.
They've told us to go back home and contact them tomorrow.
We turned up here today, and as soon as we got in the queue, we got to the desk, and they said, that's it, the flight's cancelled. So we said, what do we do now? We're stuck here with a gang of kids and that as well.
Just gutted. That's the word for it, really, gutted.
The biggest operator to Yugoslavia, Yugo Tours, has 11,000 Britons in the country at the moment. They'll be flown home in an emergency airlift.
We shall be flying them back over these next few days, starting from tomorrow, and if necessary, finishing it by Tuesday.
Most of the 15,000 British holidaymakers currently in Yugoslavia are on the Adriatic coast around Dubrovnik, a long way from the trouble in the north of the country. Around 500,000 Britons were expected to holiday in Yugoslavia this year. Those forced to cancel their holidays are not covered by their insurance, but they will get their money back.
Most insurance policies will not cover you for situations of war or civil unrest, so you will not be covered by that. But of course, if you talk to a tour operator, all ABTA tour operators are giving people full refunds if they've not yet commenced their holiday. Some people, of course, will be on holiday already, and I'm sure the tour operators will be giving them a part refund.
British holidaymakers in Yugoslavia are being advised to stay in their hotels and wait for news of the special charter flights to bring them home early.
It was the forceful character of Marshal Tito which held Yugoslavia together until his death in 1980. But in fact, Yugoslavia's 23 million people have little in common. The country is made up of 6 republics, each with a degree of autonomy. Slovenia and Croatia are fighting for independence as part of an association of sovereign states, while Montenegro and Serbia want a strong, highly centralized system dominated as now by Serbia. Those problems are compounded by its 2 alphabets, 3 religions, 5 languages and 12 ethnic groups. The economy's in a mess. Inflation was 120% last year, industrial output's fallen by 20%, tourism was down 60% even before this crisis, and Slovenia's declaration of independence could deprive Yugoslavia of 35% of its exports.
The West is worried about the example that Yugoslavia might set to the rest of the world. Disintegration in Yugoslavia, then perhaps in Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union and so on. But I think that's really a bit hard on those 2 republics.
Britain's adopting the same line as most other countries. It doesn't want to get involved in the internal affairs of Yugoslavia and hopes the Yugoslavs can sort out their problems for themselves. But as the internal situation deteriorates, there's bound to be pressure for the international community to help. Mark Webster, News at 10, Westminster.
On the road north from Croatia, close to the Slovene frontier, these lorries were turning back this morning. Their drivers complained to us that there was shooting up ahead, though they didn't know precisely where. At the border with Slovenia, locals had blocked a bridge with trucks in an effort, they said, to stop any incoming tanks or any other vehicles from the Federal Army. As Yugoslav Air Force jets passed overhead, villagers here told us they were bombing to the north. Beneath the bridge, wagons and farm vehicles prevented tanks passing on an alternative track. The local Slovene police have advised us to move away from the bridge because they believe the Air Force may well return and bomb it in order to remove this obstacle. Now, whether that's a realistic fear or not, it serves to emphasize nonetheless just how deep the suspicion is between local people here and the federal forces. The drivers of the trucks kept listening for some sound of the returning jets, trying to identify distant planes in the sky. Close to Maribor, a frontier town near the Austrian border with Slovenia, there were more roadblocks. This time they were manned by Slovenian militiamen in full combat gear, and they too confirmed reports of bombing. Outside Maribor itself, columns of trucks were lined up. Some had been halted here for more than 2 days by the fighting up ahead. And north of the town, just 14 kilometers from Austria, the first evidence of federal troops attacking roadblocks with tanks. Carcasses from a refrigerated meat wagon lay strewn about the road. Some trucks had been blown or pushed clear of the carriageway altogether. Others were still smouldering wrecks, including this one, which appeared to be the remains of a British truck. And more eyewitness accounts here of tanks attacking buildings up ahead at the frontier, and apparently attacking civilian targets as well. This man didn't wish to be named.
Just guns shooting, and then going airplanes up, and then tanks shooting. 2 times, I don't know, I think 2 times, but the second time, how I say, shoot in the hill, 1 house, and broken this house 2 pieces.
They destroyed a house?
Destroyed the house.
As we filmed here, the sound of distant shelling was just about audible. And finally, a little over 10 kilometers from the Austro-Slovenian border, the sight of Federal Forces tanks barring our way forward. An intermittent battle was happening below us. There were 8 Soviet-built tanks shelling a Slovenian roadblock every now and then, just up ahead, out of sight. The Slovenian defense minister had said yesterday his country was at war with the federal forces, and here was the evidence before us. And behind us, Slovenian militiamen scouting from positions in the hills, men on foot with small arms pitting their wits against the tanks in the valley below.
It was a loud and overt show of strength by Yugoslavia's armed forces. Warplanes roared across Slovenia, strafing and bombing strategic targets as if to intimidate the breakaway republic. On the road to Ljubljana, MiGs screamed over our heads, diving in to attack Slovenian defences. In their sights, a blockade of lorries. Drivers and local civilians ran for their lives. Seconds later, bomb blasts could be heard nearby. The planes were clearly trying to blast a way through the barricades to open up the road. Their aim to free a column of their own armoured cars which had been trapped by Slovenian defence forces for nearly 24 hours. But the main damage inflicted by the airstrike was on the lorries and their drivers. Several were left writhing in agony on the ground. We counted 7 dead, Albanians, Turks and Yugoslavs. Yet from earlier reconnaissance, the federal warplanes must have known there were civilians in the lorries before they attacked. Nearby, a farmhouse and livestock had been destroyed. The farmer lay dead beside his smouldering barn.
What we've witnessed here today seems like a clear declaration of war by the Federal Army, yet most of their victims here have been not soldiers but civilians. After this, the Slovenians are hardly likely to want to talk about peace and unity.
The anger against all Yugoslavia, this is the biggest problem. Now the bridges are broken, destroyed. There's no way back.
The whole of Slovenia seemed shocked and angered at the heavy-handed tactics of the National Army, and they were fighting back. In shootouts across the state, Slovenia's lightly armed defence forces were fighting to protect their newly declared independence. For a while, it looked like civil war. Some federal troops even began surrendering in the face of Slovenian fire. The army was clearly surprised by the level of resistance. At least 10 Yugoslav troops had died. But then, amid escalating violence, the central government suddenly declared a ceasefire. Federal Prime Minister Ante Markovic appeared on television soon after, regretting the loss of life and offering to start peaceful negotiations. But it's thought the central government had become worried that the army crackdown was getting out of hand and that Europe had put pressure on them to call a halt. The Yugoslav forces claimed they'd already achieved their objective, securing the national borders. Tonight, Slovenia's president accepted the ceasefire in principle, though neither side has withdrawn. In the wake of 2 days of violence, there's now an uneasy standoff and precious little trust. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Slovenia.
Belgrade wants well, I should rather say the army wants to re-establish the old Yugoslavia, the Yugoslavia that we once knew, the Bolshevik, or if you want, the communist system. And this is a plan that is really directed against the democratic government of Slovenia and Croatia.
Will you settle for anything less than full independence now?
Well, you see, the problem is that it is difficult, really, to envisage a union or an association of Yugoslav republics after the experience that we have had with the army that we have ourselves been financing.
You want an independent Slovenia in an ideal world, but you accept that you really will have probably to settle for some new kind of confederation in a new kind of Yugoslavia.
Well, we are ready for all options, actually. We are ready for compromise, of course, and it would be silly for us if we weren't.
See, what many outsiders are saying is that this whole business has now unleashed forces of nationalism in the republics which it is going to be very hard to contain again?
Well, certainly we have done nothing nationalistic or chauvinistic or anything. We have just been invaded by the army. This is an act of invasion or aggression, if you want. This is no civil war, if that's what you are trying to imply.
Many people believe that the roots of this thing were economic and social, and that now those roots have become polluted by national interests.
Well, the root of this evil is, I think, 70 years old or maybe 45 years old, because components which do not belong together have been put together in a very awkward way. Now, the communists have managed to keep those nations together by force, and once you start with democratic processes, these old ties have somehow ceased to exist.
And finally, Mr. Rupel, then, do you believe then perhaps that forces like the European community, like these foreign ministers, could perhaps be the mediators who could help you forge this new order, whatever it is to be?
Well, I think that that's quite correct, yes. I think that the EC ministers, or the EC authorities anyway, are in a perfect position to put pressure on the central government of Yugoslavia to stop sending bombs and start sending negotiators, people that we could talk to.
From first light this morning, it was clear the fragile ceasefire was barely holding. Even as the EC foreign ministers flew back to Luxembourg, these militia were once more fanning out around the Brioni army base south of the Slovenian capital. Across the fields, the tanks and sentries of the Federal Army, still trapped by impromptu barricades and hidden landmines. No peace talks here, and no backing down. On major roads, no relaxation in Slovenian security measures. This Red Cross team among those held at gunpoint while police searched their vehicles. At midday, Slovenians heard their president tell them there was no turning back from independence. In bars and cafes, they weighed Slovenia's stand against the probability of continuing violence. Violence which has stiffened resolve in the village preparing to bury the farmer killed during yesterday's air raids.
What has happened is terrible, but I believe our president and people should complete the task we have begun.
Close by one attempt at conciliation, Slovenian negotiators trying to find a way of releasing this federal convoy, trapped for 2 days by barricades and threatened by plastic explosives on a bridge overhead. The continuing blockade of the main highway between the Croatian and Slovenian capitals is an indication that whatever the politicians may say, deep suspicions remain on both sides. If that situation persists, it can only heighten fears of further bloodshed. Robert Hall, ITN, Slovenia.
As sirens wailed across Slovenia, its people ran in fear. The capital, Ljubljana, had the feel of a city under siege. The Federal Army had threatened decisive military action unless Slovenia honoured the ceasefire. That ultimatum had just expired. In underground shelters, citizens were warned of an air raid. The city froze, but no planes came. There was no proof they'd ever taken off. For the moment, a war of nerves had replaced the fighting. Slovenia's defence forces became increasingly twitchy. Security was tightened amid reports that Yugoslav federal troops dressed in plain clothes were trying to infiltrate the city. Slovenia braced itself for more aggression. The dozens of roadblocks set up to stall the advancing Yugoslav army now also served as barricades, behind which the Slovenians had cut themselves off from the outside world. Adding to their sense of isolation, the main airport had been sealed and shelled by the federal troops. That same army also controlled most border posts. Slovenia was effectively locked inside. Peering across the frontier, the neighbouring Austrian army, keen to make sure Yugoslavia's problems didn't spill over. The European community was exerting diplomatic pressure to resolve the conflict, threatening to cut off economic aid unless the warring factions stuck to the peace initiative. Slovenia's President Milan Kučan, now flanked by armed bodyguards, said his government was willing to freeze its drive towards independence and negotiate, but only if the army pulled out. Tonight, he had his chance when Federal Prime Minister Anton Markovic paid an unexpected visit to Ljubljana to try and work out a compromise. With him came the region's military commander. It seems Yugoslavia's armed forces are literally calling the shots, ready to step in if the politicians fail to keep the country united. Like these defense force troops, the whole of Slovenia is waiting anxiously tonight to discover whether their future will be resolved by peace or by war. Jeremy Thompson, ITN in Ljubljana.
In cathedrals and churches across northern Yugoslavia, there were fervent prayers for peace today. Communities horrified by the bloodshed, hopeful that even at this late stage, Yugoslavia might yet avoid civil war. That hope foremost in the mind of Federal Prime Minister Ante Markovic, who travelled to Slovenia in the knowledge that last Friday's peace agreement had disintegrated within 24 hours. The key issue for those Slovenians waiting for news of a breakthrough was their right to independence, though their president has stressed again that they will agree to a 3-month delay on any further changes in their constitution. Any discussions must be overshadowed by uncertainty over the attitude of the Federal Army. Last night's ultimatum was delivered not by a politician, but by a member of the High Command, his tone making it clear that the army's patience was wearing thin. Added to that, the Slovenians' fear that they may already be under attack leads many experts to believe both sides may feel unable to turn back.
Things are not under control anymore. It is very doubtful, it's a big question mark, under which orders, for example, the army is acting. Is it acting on its own? Is it still listening, partly at least, to the federal government? And of course, it is not listening to its constitutional supreme commander, which is the presidency, because the presidency really doesn't exist.
In Croatia, parliamentarians have been guarded in their response to Slovenia's hard line. The independence declaration here has been followed by a threat from Serbian extremists on Croatia's southern frontier, their security forces already on high alert. Many Croatian parliamentarians share the conviction with their Slovenian counterparts that the army may well have given the politicians one last chance. There is still talk of a peaceful solution here tonight, but it seems that only major concessions can lead to a step back from the precipice. Robert Hall, ITN, Zagreb.
It was stalemate on Highway 1 tonight. Slovenian militia still dug in on the wooded hillside overlooking the road to Ljubljana, prepared for the worst. For 5 days now, they've surrounded an armoured column of Yugoslav troops trapped on the motorway below. The Slovenians are demanding that the army leave their weapons and withdraw. So far, there's been no compromise. Across Slovenia, federal troops have found themselves beleaguered, marooned at the border or in their barracks. They claim they've been provoked by the local people who cut off their supplies. Tense and frustrated, the soldiers have kept their rocket launchers primed in readiness. Tonight, the army generals ordered their troops to shoot if attacked. They promised to airdrop supplies to keep the men going until an orderly withdrawal could be worked out. There's been contact between the two armies, but little trust. Yugoslav officers resent the demand for international observers to monitor the truce. Unless the military deadlock can be resolved, the peace initiative remains in jeopardy. Slovenian militia certainly weren't relaxing their defences of the capital, checking for political army undercover agents. Though the ceasefire was still precarious, most Slovenians believe they'd already achieved a victory on the road to independence.
I think that we have shown the so-called Yugoslav brotherly army that they are not brotherly at all and that they have been beaten any place, any time.
Slovenians showed no love lost for the army as they cleared the debris of battle from their alpine fields. The villagers of Moste had set this Yugoslav tank ablaze and said they'd do the same again unless the army was put under control. Whether or not they win their independence in the end, the people of Slovenia won't feel safe until all traces of the Yugoslav army have finally been removed from their territory. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10 in Slovenia.
The help and intervention by EC ministers for foreign affairs was vital and very useful. And as far as Croatia is concerned, I am convinced that it is a workable formula. The Croatian parliament and authorities do not have any reservation, and all conditions as presented by the Troika are acceptable.
But on the other hand, one feels it is just a breathing space that you are still determined to go on after 90 days with your independence plans.
Of course, it is a breathing period, but actually what I wish to underline that it is of paramount importance a ceasefire, and to see that this ceasefire is respected and protected in this area. So I'm rather more inclined to concentrate on the period immediately in front of us and not at the moment to look on the period after the expiry of 90 days.
Well, I want to look at the role of the army in that in just a moment, but the other immediate event coming up externally is the meeting of the CSCE group in Vienna on Wednesday. Is there anything they can do?
Of course, I think here is the area which has been now ignited. It is very close to the Central Europe, and we are part of the Europe, and therefore I think that all principles which are laid down in the Paris Charter for Europe and CSC documents for reacting on any area which is involved in violence is the right time to see what can be implemented in the present situation.
If you confess that you need the outside help of diplomats and foreign ministers, yes, is it not probable that you also need the outside help of some kind of security force that is going to see that this thing works?
I think that this situation might develop very soon, or I'm afraid, and therefore some kind of the peace-making forces should be also considered, that we are approaching appropriate time to implement into Slovenia, Croatia, and the rest of the present Yugoslavia.
In other words,
mainly
you think
here is the main problem is with the behavior of the army. The army is the old-fashioned, still Bolshevik or communist-dominated establishment. They are trying to preserve status quo, and they are trying to keep the domination of the communists over this area, and this is the root of the problem.
There is now to be a new Croatian president of the Republic as a result of the negotiations over the last few days.
Yes.
Does he have the charisma, the power to control the army, or is it, do you think, now impossible?
By constitution he has a power. Now it is the question whether those who are still having in the army actual power, whether they will obey the decisions worked out in the presidency. So it is a great step forward with intervention of the European Troika, and we do appreciate it very much, but the problem is not solved, and I think that everybody should concentrate how these conditions which have been implemented with the assistance of Europe will be observed.
Contact with the Slovenian militia. 5 miles north of Slovenia's southern border, federal armoured units deploying against the first of a series of roadblocks on the road to Ljubljana.
Look at the tanks! They must go down! They must go down!
The armoured columns had moved out at speed earlier this morning from southern Croatia. There was no time for niceties. This village among those assessing the damage after the tanks had passed through. But the advance came to an abrupt halt. Slovenian militia have had a week to prepare, and their federal conscripts may have to fight their way up the only main road to the Slovenian capital.
There were 2 trucks that were blocking the way, and for a while it was quiet. Then the barricade blew up. I don't know if it was hit or if it was mined. And then shortly after that, there was firing we heard from the woods. And the tanks moved in, the column moved in and started trying to go into to the left of the barricade.
The army called in airstrikes against opposing troops here and further north. But they were already taking casualties in the face of determined counterfire. This is just what Croatia, Slovenia and the international community feared. The Federal High Command was warning only last night that direct threats against its forces would be met by what it termed massive retaliation. It does now seem that the Federal Army's patience has finally run out. In the past hour, more reinforcements have been moving north out of Zagreb. The signs are that the drive to relieve besieged federal units has begun. More airstrikes have been reported south of Ljubljana, and casualties are mounting. It seems that a peaceful settlement for Yugoslavia has failed. Robert Hall, ITN, Zagreb.
The bloody aftermath of another battle. Yugoslav soldiers carry away their injured comrades. Their unit had been attacked by a Slovenian militia as it tried to withdraw to barracks. They claimed they'd only fired back because the defense forces stopped them. One of the wounded, a 21-year-old Serbian conscript, wept in pain and grief. His best friend had died next to him. He was one of 2 federal soldiers killed in the shootout when the Slovenians ambushed them at a roadblock half a mile back down the highway.
The cost of this tragic conflict is mounting every day, and there are now fears that unless a compromise is worked out quickly, this may be only the start of the killing. A column of army tanks on its way from Croatia to rescue the beleaguered unit was itself pinned down 10 miles away. While Slovenian troops covered the convoy from the hills above, one civilian seemed unaware of the danger. The Slovenian firepower proved accurate and awesome. They seemed determined to stop the army at any cost. Just ahead, warplanes swooped down to try and blast a way through for their heavy armor trapped on the ground. A pall of smoke marked the target. The planes had wrecked, but not removed the roadblock. When we returned to the unit of mobile anti-aircraft guns, the Yugoslav troops were still waiting for help to arrive. They asked us for food and drink. The young soldiers, hungry and frightened, told us they'd been trapped on the highway for 6 days now without supplies. You have orders to retreat to base, to go to a base? Do you have orders?
Yeah.
From your commander?
Just return to base, nothing else. No more killing, no more...
But you have had to fight many times.
Yeah, we have to. If we don't, they're gonna kill us.
How do you feel about this?
Terrible, terrible, believe me, terrible. I'm young, I'm 19 years old. It's terrible.
You don't want to fight?
Nobody wants to fight. Ask, everybody ask him. Nobody wants to fight.
As if to reflect that common wish for peace, a local Slovenian farmer appeared with milk and water. The Yugoslavians were pathetically grateful, telling him they had no wish to fight his people. The farmer said he just felt sad for the soldiers. Sergeant Sasha Pantic blamed the politicians for this conflict and killing. The soldiers wanted it to stop. They were just searching for a way to get home in peace. Air raid sirens whined across the Slovenian capital again today. Army planes buzzed the city, but there was no evidence of bombing, just more raw nerves in this psychological war. Deep in the shelters of a maternity hospital, mothers fed their tiny babies who'd been born into this state of chaos. Back on Highway 1, the Yugoslav troops still waiting to be rescued. Reluctant fighters as they are, they dutifully reloaded their weapons as another night of tension approached. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Slovenia.
Mr. Keck, what information can you give us on the fighting?
Yes, the situation is going more and more serious. It looks like this is a real war. There were some aircraft bombing the surroundings of the block tank columns, and there are new tank columns coming from Zagreb direction. There's one thing, then the army is attacking the television and radio transmitters, so In some parts of Slovenia, we cannot see television and get the radio signal. And the Zagreb airport is being closed now. So there are some bombing and some surroundings of these tanks columns that are blocked on the way from Croatia to Slovenia. So this is quite serious now, I suppose.
We've heard reports that the Yugoslav planes have been bombing their own troops on the ground. Is that correct?
Yeah, the surrounding of their own groups, because their troops are blocked usually on the roads, and they want to protect them or to make their passing possible. So they are bombing the surroundings of these troops that there we are. There are our positions is there. So that's why you got the information that they are bombing their own troops.
We hear in London, Mr. Keck, the problem is that Slovene defence units have trapped armed forces there on the ground and are not allowing the armed forces to return to their barracks in accordance with the ceasefire.
Yes, the accord of the ceasefire was reached, but there were some conditions of how to implement this. And one of the conditions was that there is no moving of the units before the common or both side agreements. The army wanted to move them without the agreement from our side. That's the point.
Mr. Keck in Slovenia, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
That's right. I had a very good conversation on the phone with Secretary Hurd, and we both will support during the meeting of the CSE tomorrow and on Thursday in Prague a proposition to send their observers.
Will these be armed observers, or what sort of observers will they be?
This has to be discussed, but the important thing is that there will be an additional element to avoid military violence, which is still a pending danger.
Well, now, Dr. Mock, what is the situation at the moment on Austria's border with Yugoslavia? Has there been any crossing into your territory by Slovenian or Yugoslav forces?
As far as I know, this afternoon, such accidents did not happen.
But this is your grave concern, presumably?
The grave concern is the danger of a civil war in Yugoslavia. That's why we tried for many months to point to the grave danger of such a situation. That's why we proposed different operational means to maintain the dialogue. And that's why we think it's important that with the authority, the political authority of the European community, everything is done to respect the agreement concluded between the central government in Belgrade, the governments of the two republics, Croatia and Slovenia, and the European community. Because if there's a peaceful evolution, I could imagine recognition of both countries.
You can imagine there being an independent Croatia and an independent Slovenia?
If there is a peaceful and negotiated solution of the present crisis.
What is your sense of Belgrade's attitude to the CSCE meeting tomorrow? I mean, Yugoslavia has to agree whatever you agree there, and that includes the sending of observers.
I had the feeling that as far as the first two stages of the CSC procedure is concerned, the central government in Belgrade responded very correctly. So I think also the central government has a great interest not only to avoid the danger of civil war, but also to do everything that the agreement between the European community and the partners in Yugoslavia will be fully applied.
The problem, Dr. Mock, is that we wonder in the end whether the central government in Belgrade is in control of the army, and one wonders how the army can be got under control.
This is a very legitimate remark, but I think if we support this agreement, and if we support also the central government against excess of decisions of the army, there is a chance to get over control, because also the army command sees the difficulty it finds in its own ranks when fighting the peoples of Croatia and Slovenia.
Can I ask you finally, Dr. Mock, how soon then do you think observers could be on the ground in Yugoslavia, and could they be extended to some kind of peacekeeping force?
I could only say, having in mind the dangerous situation, as soon as possible. I think if there is an agreement, the next 2 days, within the framework of CSE, such observers should be on the ground during the following weekend. And if there's no such agreement, I hope very much that the European community will take up the Italian-German proposal of EC observers and will offer these observer teams to the Yugoslavian government in Belgrade and the two republics, and will also send them during the forthcoming weekend.
So while Croatia waits, the Slovenian capital of Ljubljana is also bracing itself to see whether the convoy will attack that city. Our reporter Joan Thurkettle spoke a few moments ago to the Slovenian Deputy Foreign Minister in Ljubljana.
Yeah, we are threatened by Defense Minister Kadijevic to see the war which was not seen ever in Europe. So to be destroyed completely here in Slovenia. And that was said to the member of presidency, to Purkovski, who was yesterday here in Ljubljana. Okay.
And tell me please, what is happening there at the moment?
There are movings of units of Yugoslav army still. And we don't open any fire because we try to keep this cease of fire which was announced from our side yesterday, 9 p.m. But there is no will from their side to manage this.
Have they crossed the border yet into your country?
Sorry?
Have they crossed the border yet?
Who?
The Yugoslav army. The armored.
From Belgrade?
The armored column.
No, this is 400 kilometers far away. It's impossible to come here in a few hours.
Okay, and have you had any air attacks this morning?
Not yet in Ljubljana. They were in some other cities, northwest Slovenia.
And what is the atmosphere like there?
Yeah, it's difficult atmosphere.
Well, I think that American and British policy are quite consistent in not wanting to see certainly the imposition of force as a means of keeping the country together. But on the other hand, I don't think we're too comfortable with the notion of just rapid falling apart of the nation into many different republics. Obviously, Slovenia and Croatia have a strong interest in greater independence. Croatia more perhaps within a looser confederation. Slovenia very determined to have an independent state. And that might eventually have to be realized. But again, there are consequences if the breakup is very fast, not only in Yugoslavia, but consequences elsewhere in Europe, where there are nationalist ambitions among various peoples and borders that have been recognized for a long time that come into question. So it's an uncomfortable situation. Well, obviously, the great problem of violence and loss of life is the first one, but I think our hope is that this could be negotiated in a calmer atmosphere and maybe some new structure develop out of that.
Clearly, the United States and Europe are looking to every possible diplomatic device to try to prevent this thing falling into complete civil war. Would you at this moment rule out any possible military involvement by anybody outside Yugoslavia?
I don't see any possibility of military involvement at the moment. I can't imagine that would prove useful in any way. On the other hand, very strong representations are being made by the United States, Britain, by the European community, and by the 35 meeting in Prague today.
There was a time when Yugoslavia was such a critical buffer state, when we would have been highly exercised by the breakup of the country. There's a sense in the aftermath of the Cold War that perhaps people don't care as much as they would have done.
Well, it's probably an interesting problem that we are now facing. The most serious problem in Europe today is the instability in Yugoslavia. At least that's the perception. we've come so far so fast is the phrase. You know, no one would have imagined that the Berlin Wall would come down, that Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, the unification of Germany, all those things have happened with blinding speed. And now in the Soviet Union, you have the possibility of either a course of instability that could lead up to the breakup of the country or perhaps a movement toward true democracy. All these things have sort of created an attitude that I think we expect to look at Yugoslavia in totally different terms than the problems that were presented by the Soviet threat to Western Europe.
Professor Lawrence Friedman of the Department of War Studies at the University of London joins me now. Professor, have the Yugoslav armed forces taken matters entirely into their own hands?
Well, it certainly looks like it at the moment. This is an operation they've been preparing for some time and clearly were hurt by the way that they botched the initial phase of this operation, then humiliated by the Slovenes. I don't think they want that to happen again.
As we've just seen in Edward Sturton's report, the Army Officer Corps is dominated by Serbs. Technically, they're controlled by a Croat president. Now, is the army likely to stage a coup against the government?
My impression is that it's bypassing the government at the moment. You must remember that this Croatian president has only been in office for a couple of days and was not in office when this started. So he has no basis to establish his authority, and I suspect he's seen by the generals as part of the enemy.
Is he in any sense in control?
No, but he may be in control politically, and I think that could become relevant if there's an attempt to arrange an international intervention of some sort, because he could make some sort of appeal as the head of the national government.
Well, now, the West seems to have shifted its attitude overnight. It seems that Washington is now actually supporting the breakaway states if the breakaway states can break away peacefully.
Well, I'm afraid the West misjudged this whole crisis. It's been coming for a long time. Everybody's advertised their intentions. But the principle of holding countries together, come what may, dominated things. Now what's happening is people realise that Yugoslavia can't be held together peacefully, and therefore you're looking at ways of making something out of a bad job. Nobody suggests that there's a good solution to this, but there may be some better ones. But unfortunately, you can't suddenly shift positions like this in the middle of a crisis. It just confuses all diplomacy, and I think one of the problems now is that the West is really at a loss to know what to do about this.
Well, on News at 10 last night, the Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd said there's nothing the West can do to stop the breakup. Do you believe that that is implicit support for the breakup?
I think there is now a definite shift, that a recognition at some point we may be recognising Slovenian and Croatian governments. The problem, I think, is now a different one, that you've got real violence taking place. We may be on the verge of a major operation against Croatia and Slovenia, though they may wait a bit and see if there's more concessions from those countries, but we may be on the verge of that. There are other problems coming up behind in Yugoslavia. The position of the Kosovo, the Albanian minority in Kosovo, is very serious still. Macedonia is looked at by Greece and Bulgaria as possibly part of their territory. There's lots of other problems coming up behind. So the international community can't wash its hands of this, but by mishandling it to start with, it's not really quite sure what its entree is into the solution of the problem.
Professor Friedman, thanks very much indeed for that assessment. A ceasefire seems to be holding in Yugoslavia, with federal troops halting their advance on the breakaway republics of Slovenia and Croatia. Some units have returned to barracks, while the politicians try to negotiate a lasting truce. The collective presidency of Yugoslavia met this morning, and another EC mission has also flown out to observe the truce. Federal troops inside Slovenia are reported to be pulling out. But most of the massive convoy which advanced from Belgrade towards Zagreb yesterday is still thought to be in position along the Croatian border. Our reporter Robert Hall is in Zagreb.
These men are not professional soldiers. The Defence Force has only been operating for a matter of months, but they have put up determined resistance against federal conscripts. Resistance which means that some international border posts are still in Slovene hands, much to the annoyance of the army and, it seems, the presidency. Although the Slovenes have only faced a fraction of what the federal army could throw against them, their commanders remain confident that they would be effective against a major attack. Such a move had begun to look increasingly unlikely. Federal units advancing from Belgrade stopped short of Croatia, Others have been returning to barracks. On a country road 400 kilometres northwest, another group of young men are trundling a captured federal personnel carrier towards the local Slovene police station. They say they have sympathy for their conscripted countrymen, but they'll do what's necessary.
We can fight them back. It's not so hopeless, you see. We can fight. It's no matter, maybe they can never win, you see. Long term, short term, never win. Nobody wants to shoot his own people. I can't shoot in the soldier because I don't know who he is. He is my age, maybe he is my neighbor, but he is in the army. I won't shoot in them.
Tonight's ultimatum has once again raised doubts over whether the ceasefire will hold or whether the young of Yugoslavia will again die for ideals that appear to be beyond the negotiating table. Robert Hall, News at 10, Zagreb.
Across Slovenia, which is overwhelmingly a place of small holdings and villages, the huge majority of people here who have seen or heard no sign of trouble in recent days get on with the pressing tasks of the day, as they have done throughout. Though it may have looked otherwise at times on television reports, the violence here was always extremely localized. This newly installed border checkpoint on the Slovene-Croatian frontier, a point of tension so recently, was completely deserted this morning. No apparent interest in anyone checking anything passing through. Further along the road, the recent blockades blasted by federal tanks are now becoming sites of interest for local people, though there are a number of main roads that still remain completely or partially blockaded by tank traps and trucks. However, there are still plenty of Federal Army tanks in some areas of Croatia. The enclaves, where in towns like Glina, just 50 miles from Zagreb, 70% of people are Serbian. So although the Federal Army appears to be pulling back to barracks in both of the states, there are nonetheless some places where it remains on the streets to protect the minority Serbian population. Glina is one of those places. This afternoon, the Croatian Information Minister said tanks were also deployed in other Serbian-populated areas, where he said Serbian militias were also active. Though in Glina, Croatian military police stand only a few yards away from the federal tank units, which are here, they say, to protect the Serbs. The federal president says the Prime Minister is now in control of the army and has ordered Slovene militias to return to their barracks by midnight. Meanwhile, there was evidence today of federal troops leaving Slovenia aboard transporters, as demanded by the Slovene government.
It was General Agic, the Chief of Staff and hardline communist, who unilaterally defied Defence Minister Kadjevic and his deputy and ordered the army to crush the nationalist challenges from Slovenia. Today, Defence Minister Kadjevic and his deputy General Brovet, who no one had been able to track down in recent days, were back in command. Agic had been eclipsed, his own future and that of his sizable Serbian officer support unclear. Unprecedented warning messages from EC nations and the British Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, direct to the Defence Minister, bypassing the government, strongly requested and urged that the Yugoslav National Army obey the presidency and the ceasefire. Western support then for the Defence Minister to reassert control.
Kadjevic is a constitutionalist. In the past few days, while the military seemed to have been out of control, there's been no sign of him. I think his reappearance shows that he again has the ascendancy within the military hierarchy, that he is going to work with the federal politicians, and that therefore there may be some prospect of the peace being maintained in Yugoslavia.
In today's Talking Point, we look at the continuing crisis in Yugoslavia. Should the breakaway republics be given the chance to form nations if they wish, or is Yugoslavia right to try to stop them? With me now is Breda Wilkinson, a Slovenian now living in this country, but with close family and friends in Slovenia, and Feodor Starčević from the Yugoslav embassy. Breda Wilkinson, if I could start with you. Slovenians want independence even if it means the breakup of the country?
Well, I am not a politician, and I'm here really basically. I have been living in this country for 27 years with very close ties with Slovenia. My parents are there, my sister is there, all my family is there, all my friends. It is my home and my country. And I feel that what has been happening to Slovenians and to Slovenia is actually a terrible violation and a terrible thing to happen to them. They never wanted this kind of force and violence to be used against them, and they never expected it. It has touched us here immensely because we're worried about them all the time. Our lives are really only telephones, news, television news, radio news, that is all we do. I feel that if that is what the nation wanted, well, who are we to say they shouldn't have it? This is really...
Well, Mr. Starcevic, if what Breda Wilkinson says is true, the fault lies at the feet of the Yugoslav government.
Not necessarily. I tend to agree with Mrs. Wilkinson on a number of points. But I would wish to say that the wisdom of political leaders of peoples lie basically on the premise that they can achieve the goals that are best for their peoples, not risking the lives of those peoples.
Are you saying that the goals that you believe Slovenians should have are different from the goals that Slovenians believe Slovenians should have?
If the Slovenian nation is intent on achieving their independence, they will achieve their independence. There is no way to stop that. There is no force in the world that can stop the determination of people to achieve their independence. And I strongly believe that there was no one in Yugoslavia actually willing to prevent Slovenians from achieving their independence.
Well,
the issue was different, if I could explain.
If it is true what Mr. Tacic is saying, then why were the tanks called in then? I mean, you see, the thing is that we didn't expect it either. I was in Yugoslavia on Monday before it happened. I flew there with my family, and I was there, you know, not expecting any problems whatsoever.
Mr. Starcevic, why did the army move in then?
My understanding that the limited contingent of the army, less than 2,000, moved to secure border crossings at the explicit orders of the federal authorities. I believe what they are saying is true, that they did not expect such fierce resistance and the treatment of the foreign outside occupation army. On retrospect, maybe it shouldn't have been handled with the army. I do believe that peaceful methods should have been employed, but at the same time, one does not achieve independence in one country that was together for more than 70 years by declaring that you become independent and next day you carry out all the practical aspects of its independence.
Is that not a fair point, Mrs.
Wilson? Something? As we all know, they had the first democratic election in Yugoslavia. In Slovenia, that was in July, and democratic government was elected. Later on the 23rd of December, there was a plebiscite where the people were asked what they wanted, and they voted for independence. Fine. So it is the wish of the people, and from then on, the legal things have been implementing all the time, and the date of the 26th of June has always been quoted. So everybody knew it was happening and nobody expected any problems. That is all that I know. I'm not a politician, please. And really, politics are not my forte. All I'm concerned is these poor people there are suffering. What for? Who are they protecting? Who are the tanks protecting? What borders? Did Austria invade us or Italy? They're protecting towards their own people. And also, I must stress, because I have plenty of friends in Serbia, really. I have got lots of friends that I love dearly, really, and my heart goes out to their parents, mothers, whose sons are at the moment in the army, 18, 19 years old, who are being killed. And what for? Believe you me, it is not, I feel as sorry for them as I feel sorry for my own people, because it is a futile thing. I don't know what we're trying to achieve.
Mr. Starcevic, to what extent is this, at the basic level, an ethnic dispute between Serbs in the government and in the army, and Slovenians and Croatians?
I don't think it's an important element, though certainly it is there. The independence of Slovenia was not disputed by Serbs. Actually, the Serbian leaders said you're free to go as far as we are concerned any moment. The trouble is that Croatia seems to be intent to follow Slovenia in this course. And you know that Croatia is not as nationally homogeneous as is Slovenia. There are 600,000 Serbs there.
So you're saying the government would allow Slovenia to secede but not Croatia?
No, I'm not saying that. Everybody should agree on the modalities of agreement to live in one sort of Yugoslavia that is acceptable for all, or indeed work out the orderly terms of secession. This is what was lacking, I think, and that sense of responsibility not to take any actions that plunged the rest of the country possibly in the civil war. That was missed, I think,
very
in
briefly,
the Slovenian behavior.
From both of you, very, very briefly, Mr. Sarcevic, will Slovenia acquire independence?
From whatever it has shown in the past several days, I strongly believe, based on the historic precedent, that it will.
Mrs. Wilkinson?
So do I, because I think that now it is no going back, unfortunately, after the force has been used so brutally.
Breda Wilkinson, Fyodor Starcevic, thank you both very much indeed. And over now to the weather studio and Sean.
In the restrained calm of The Hague, the 12 of the European Community began emergency discussions both on further sanctions against Yugoslav republics and to promote peaceful dialogue, within hours of the dawn decision by the 35-nation Conference on European Security in Prague to dispatch some kind of monitoring force. Despite intense efforts in the past 7 days by 3 consecutive EC delegations to find a basis for outside mediation in Yugoslavia, there was here a sense of despair that these frantic diplomatic efforts may only create a pause in what remains an inevitable slide into prolonged civil conflict. How fragile do you think the situation is still at the moment?
Well, it is fragile, and we are trying to make that it should be less, but it is difficult.
Outside, a group of Croatians reminded foreign ministers of the number of conflicting nationalist circles which diplomacy is trying to square at a time when in Yugoslavia itself there seems to be a dialogue of the deaf.
Good luck to you. Thank you.
Along with the chairman's bell, the burdens of the Yugoslav crisis have now passed from the Luxembourg foreign minister to the Dutch. These deliberations coming during what one official called a phony peace, where Yugoslavia still remains poised on the brink of catastrophe. The shooting may have stopped for 36 hours, but the factors which produced several days of armed conflict on European soil remain in place. One spark could reignite them, as the EC's new rotating president later made clear.
And we would like to be instrumental in trying to solve those problems as soon as possible. Every day we wait, the ceasefire may be broken, the escalation may start again, and then we don't know where it ends.
Behind closed doors, the foreign ministers tried to lay out a mediation framework for Yugoslavia unprecedented in international diplomacy, especially on a force to monitor the ceasefire. But tonight's EC demand that Slovenia mothball its new border posts and border demarcations, returning the status quo to that before it declared independence 2 weeks ago, is likely to inflame Slovenian passions.
That the situation on the 25th of June should prevail or should be restored. So if there is any misunderstanding about that, we think that should be clarified by us.
German Foreign Minister Genscher came here with Danish backing, urging formal EC recognition of Slovenia as an independent state. That idea got nowhere. Instead, this was the message for Slovenia and Croatia.
The respect of the federal authorities in Belgrade is not a question. What we ask from the two republics is to suspend the implementation of their declarations of independence ab initio. And that's what they have to fulfill, and we will press that a democratic dialogue will take place in the next 3 months, which will change totally the constitutional structure of Yugoslavia.
France leads those who fear an independent Slovenia will lead to the return of the 19th century empires of Balkan history. Others fear the igniting of nationalist passions elsewhere.
I've had word from contacts in Czechoslovakia that it would have serious implications for Czechoslovakia as we know it, and the likely breakup of Czechoslovakia.
The Yugoslavia President Tito, the old-style Yugoslavia, is finished. And therefore what needs to be done is for the parties, that is the federal government and all the republics and provinces, to negotiate a relationship as between themselves, which is consensual and which offers the prospect of permanence.
Slovenia was looking to EC foreign ministers for strong words of support. Instead, the republic has been asked to roll back its independence. As one Slovenian journalist told me, this is not what my countrymen had hoped to hear from Europe. Nick Gowing, ITN, in The Hague.
Good evening. The leaders of Yugoslavia's two biggest republics, Serbia and Croatia, have warned of looming civil conflict. The Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic told his people to prepare for war, and a Croatian minister said he believed an attack against his republic was imminent. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister of Yugoslavia is under increasing pressure to resign because of his failure to settle the conflict. Also today, the breakaway Republic of Slovenia rejected the government's ultimatum to hand over control of its borders by tomorrow. Officials said talks with federal envoys in the Slovenian capital Ljubljana were unacceptable.
Mr. Milosevic's warnings follow a week of clashes between Serbs and Croats in south and eastern Croatia. A further overnight incident near the town of Dvor has left one Serb dead and has brought claims that Croatians dressed as Serbian border guards carried out the attack. The Serbian president called on his people to prepare for civil war if it came, but he added that Yugoslavia's problems might yet be solved by negotiation. In the meantime, the federal army should protect Serbs in other republics. At an engineering plant in the Slovenian capital of Ljubljana, production has switched from railway tracks to barricades. With 14 hours to go before the federal ultimatum expires, Slovenia too is preparing for the worst. Disappointment on the sensitive border issue followed the breakdown of a second day of talks between Slovene and federal representatives. Tonight, Slovene defence forces are still deployed against any attempt to reimpose federal control of the international borders by force. But in the Croatian capital this morning, Federal President Stipe Mesic stressed again that non-compliance would not necessarily mean military action against Slovenia.
The ultimatum announced by the army referred to specific times and dates. I don't agree with that. If the deadline passes without Slovenia's compliance, I believe we should hold further talks before any action is taken.
Tomorrow, former President Tito's summer residence on the holiday island of Brioni will host another move in the peace process, when 3 EC foreign ministers meet the leaders of Yugoslavia's divided republics. The EC delegation arrives tonight, backed by an arms embargo and by cuts in European aid. Despite some raising of the temperature by Serbia, outside pressure is mounting for Yugoslavia to find a way of ending the violence. Robert Hall, ITN, Zagreb.
A delegation from the European community is meeting Yugoslav leaders to try to stop the country sliding towards civil war. It's the third time the community has intervened in an attempt to resolve the crisis. One official called the talks on the Adriatic island of Brioni the last chance for peace. Meanwhile, ethnic violence has flared in the Croatian village of Tenja. At least one federal army soldier is reported dead and 4 Croatians wounded.
The Yugoslav presidency have chosen an appropriate location for these crucial talks. Delegates crossing the mile of sea to the island of Brioni reminded that this was a favourite with the late Marshal Tito, who held his divided country together for over 30 years. As he reflected on the chances of a lasting peace, Dutch Foreign Minister Hans van der Broek had already made it clear that this was a last chance for Yugoslavia's collective presidency to prove that they want an end to conflict. Mr van den Broek and his colleagues from Luxembourg and Portugal will want assurances that a team of EC observers will be allowed to operate safely and without hindrance within Yugoslavia. They also want to establish a framework for future talks on a long-term solution to the country's internal feuding. Today's meetings take place against a background of hardline declarations. Slovenia's President Kučan insisting that his republic will not give up control of its international borders, the Serbians warning that they were prepared for civil war if a way to peace could not be found. But on Brioni this morning, hopes of a negotiated settlement were still very much alive.
Is this the last chance, do you think, for peace?
One of the last.
The talks will initially involve individual republics and eventually all parties. The EC Troika hope to persuade the republics that outside arbitration will work. As one delegate said, if they won't trust each other, perhaps they can trust us. Robert Hall, ITN, Brioni.
The Yugoslav Republic of Croatia has accepted the European Community's plan to end the conflict with the Yugoslav federal government. Slovenia's president said it was a first step towards independence without formally approving it. The community is sending up to 50 observers to Yugoslavia to make sure the peace agreement works. It comes into effect at midnight. There's been more fighting in Croatia. Again, it involved local Croatians and Serbian extremists.
More convoys on Slovenia's border roads. But today the trucks were on their way out of the Republic, carrying federal prisoners released by their Slovene captors. At Zagreb airport, a further sign that Slovenia is complying with the overnight declaration, families grouped on the baking tarmac to see the bodies of 3 federal pilots return home. Slovene border guards are still in place at the international crossing points, but for 3 months border taxes will be paid into a joint account with the federal exchequer. But even as the EC Troika announced the declaration, these suspected Serbian terrorists were being taken into custody after more bloodshed in eastern Croatia. Talk of reconciliation is ignored in the Belgrade offices of Vojislav Šešelj, who took up his seat in the Serbian parliament today. Rarely seen without paramilitary bodyguards, he openly backs the Chetniks' fight for what they term the Greater Serbia.
We have Serbian volunteers in Slavonia, Baranja and Western Srem, and they fight to defend Serbian people.
Within Croatia?
It isn't Croatia for us, it is Serbia.
But the Chetniks appear politically isolated. Today, Serbia's normally hardline President Milosevic briefed federal troops on the EC initiative. The Serbian government appears to have accepted European intervention in both Croatia and Slovenia. So tonight, after 2 earlier and unsuccessful attempts, Yugoslavia appears to have grasped a chance to end her internal conflict. The Republic's perhaps remembering a closing remark from the Dutch Foreign Minister in the early hours of this morning, who said, "This is a ray of hope for a new order. The alternative is total disorder." Robert Hall, News at 10, Zagreb.
No one wants the European peace plan to succeed more than the Yugoslav families split by the conflict in Slovenia. Some Federal Army soldiers have found themselves having to fight against friends, even family.
The marching is disciplined, but the minds are confused. Young soldiers conscripted to defend Yugoslavia have now found themselves fighting their own people. The troops drawn from every state in the land have been allowed visits by families worried about their safety, but otherwise they've been cut off from water, power and post by Slovenians they once considered friends. Danny Pure is just 20. He gave up high school in America to serve his country. Now he's bewildered as he watches it fragment.
Well, we used to live really nice with local people. I mean, we used to have fun, drink beer, something like that. But I don't think that will happen ever again. I mean, if you hear a radio, they call you terrorist and stuff like that. We don't feel that way.
Do you ever think that you might actually come face to face with someone that you've had a drink with in the village who's a local Slovenian?
Well, I don't want to even think about it. You see, my brother-in-law lives around here, and I don't want to even think about seeing him with a gun pointing at me. I mean, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare.
We found his brother-in-law, Max, on his alpine farm where Danny used to spend his holidays. The boys have been lifelong friends. Now, on opposing sides, Max shares the nightmare of seeing Danny in his gun sights. He will fight for Slovenia if he has to, but prays the latest peace deal will spare him the dilemma of facing his own brother-in-law. The soldiers hope the ceasefire lasts too. Of the boys Danny joined up with, one's been killed, another had his leg blown off fighting the Slovenians.
Well, I don't hate him. I mean, you know, you just can't hate the whole people. I don't know. When you see all those parents, you know, and all those people who don't want to fight and who don't want to see their sons getting killed and everything, you have to stop and think about it a little bit.
Like his buddies, Danny has 49 days left to serve and just hopes he makes it out alive. The families see their young men being used to police Yugoslavia's violent ethnic troubles, a situation they can barely comprehend. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Slovenia.
There's been more fighting in Yugoslavia following a deal which should pave the way for independence for one of the country's 2 breakaway republics. Slovenia will be allowed to negotiate its independence over the next 3 months, but its neighbour, Croatia, will not be allowed to follow suit. Federal troops have already begun pulling out of Slovenia under the deal reached yesterday, but Croatia has condemned the agreement as a sellout. There's been more fighting today between Croat police and members of the Republic's Serbian minority.
The decision to pull Yugoslav troops out of Slovenia is being greeted there as de facto recognition of the Republic's independence. The withdrawal, which is to begin immediately, comes after more than 3 weeks of fighting in which the Federal Army, despite its superior weapons and equipment, suffered heavy losses at the hands of the Slovenian defence forces. The decision to pull out is said to have been taken by the Army's Supreme Command. Slovenia's representative on the federal presidency, Janez Drnovšek, described it as a historic decision for Slovenia. But neighbouring Croatia has refused to back the withdrawal unless the largely Serbian army also agrees to leave its territory. Croatians now fear that with the Slovenia problem out of the way, the army will turn on them.
There is a plan, the rumours of which have been circulating around the country, that Serbia and the army would be happy to see Slovenia go, and we're happy to see part of Croatia leave, but not in its territorial entirety, and that they would keep some certain areas populated by Serbs, or what they say is populated by Serbs actually is a mixed area, which is what they would like to claim. Serbia would like to claim this territory, and then the rest, all the rest of the country, would be called, continue to be called Yugoslavia, but of course it would be nothing but Greater Serbia.
Fighting has again broken out in the Yugoslavian Republic of Croatia, putting paid to the ceasefire arranged by the European Community. The Federal Army said Croatian forces opened fire on their men at Petronjer, south of Zagreb. The Croatians said army tanks had gone on the rampage. In Slovenia, European Community observers had begun trying to supervise the ceasefire. Jeremy Thompson is in Yugoslavia.
This is the sound of Yugoslavia's latest ceasefire. Barely 12 hours after the signing of the European-sponsored truce, fierce fighting erupted in the Croatian town of Petronjer. As always, nobody would admit who'd fired the first shots, but within minutes, Petronjer was a battlefield. Local residents cowered in shelters as army warplanes roared above, shattering their hopes of peace. Outside, Croatian special forces launched mortars at the barracks of the Federal Army, who replied with tank fire. Today's events in Petronjer were a vivid example of the almost impossible task facing these men, the monitors from the European Community. Today's mission took them not to Croatia, but the neighbouring breakaway Republic of Slovenia, where they've been supervising the withdrawal of the army following the fighting there 2 months ago. Englishman Brian Sparrow and his team had come to witness the final handover of a Yugoslav army barracks to the local Slovenian defence force. It's the role they'll be expected to play in Croatia as a vital first step towards peace, though conditions are likely to prove far more dangerous than this low-key formality. A changing of the guard that nonetheless represented an historic shift in Yugoslavia's military power.
Well, this handover has been easy enough for the European commissioners, but they know it will be a totally different proposition when they try to prize apart the warring factions on the front line of Serbia and Croatia.
The EC monitors accept they could be risking their own lives.
I think that is correct, yes. I mean, there are a lot of trigger-happy people about, an awful lot of weapons about, and without firm control, then incidents could happen at any time.
Persuading the army to leave the battlefield could be the least of the observers' problems. Until the fighting stops, they can't even begin the peace process. Jeremy Thompson, News at 10, Zagreb.
The two newly independent states of Croatia and Slovenia are celebrating tonight. Britain and the rest of Europe recognise them today, effectively breaking up Yugoslavia. It could help end the fighting, which began last June when both republics said they wanted to break away from the Serbian-dominated Yugoslav Federation. Edward Sturton at ITN reports.
It has cost the people of Croatia 6 months of war to achieve this. They declared their own independence last June. Today came the diplomatic blessing from Western Europe. And in the crowds on the streets tonight, the German flag flew alongside that of the new state. It was Germany's determination to force the pace of the recognition process that compelled the rest of Europe to act. German embassies were being opened in Slovenia and Croatia even before the final community decision had been taken. And while most EC members believe the Slovenian experiment in independence has a good chance of success, there are still doubts about Croatia. The Croatian government was only able to begin signing recognition agreements today after giving promises about the rights of the Republic's Serbian minority. But there are still doubts in Paris and London about whether they'll keep those promises.
We very much hope so, and we should be looking to them to do that. And of course, the way that they do so will condition the kind of relationship that they can expect between themselves and the European community.
We are ready to give full international, or accept full international control over the human rights for all, including minority rights, including rights of Serbs.
The recognition of Slovenia and Croatia does mean an end to what was Yugoslavia, but it doesn't settle what will replace it. Bosnia has also asked for recognition, but that won't happen yet because of concern about minorities there. Macedonia wants to be recognised too, but Greece, which has a province of Macedonia, is worried about territorial claims from a new state with the same name and historical ties. To reach this point, the Yugoslav peoples have had to endure 6,000 deaths, 1 million of their number displaced. With so much uncertainty about the final settlement, there's no guarantee that the fate of cities like Vukovar will not be visited on other areas. But the service for peace in Zagreb Cathedral this evening was at least being held with a ceasefire still holding and a UN peacekeeping force on its way.